We have as our speakers Professor Sharad Deshpande, formerly Professor of Philosophy, Department of Philosophy, University of Pune, and Professor Don Wallace, Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Delhi. And in the third part, we have as joint speakers Professor J. Garfield and Professor Nalini Bhushan, who is the Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy, Logic and Buddhist Studies, and Andrew Mellon, Professor of Humanities at Smith College, Northampton, Massachusetts, USA. This session will be chaired by Professor Moushami Guho. I request Professor Guho to please come on the stage and to kindly commence the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Hello and welcome to the fourth academic session of this international seminar. It gives me great pleasure and it's indeed an honor to chair this session because we have three highly notable speakers, Professor Sharad Deshpande, Professor Don Wallace de Cruz, who will be speaking online, Professor J. Garfield and Professor Nalini Bhushan. I'm sorry, hello. Professor J. Garfield and Professor Nalini Bhushan will be speaking online. Let me introduce our speakers today. One can say a lot about Professor Deshpande. We have a very brief introduction so that they have their time to speak. He is former professor at the Department of Philosophy, Savitribhai Phule, Pune University, former Tagore Fellow at Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, and he's currently the National Fellow, Indian Council for Philosophical Research, New Delhi. Professor Deshpande will be speaking on aesthetic theory and ontology of emotions. Professor Don de Cruz is from IIT Delhi. He is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. Formerly, he was a full-time faculty at IIT Gandhinagar and IIIT Hyderabad. After graduating in electrical engineering from the University of Kerala, he moved on to do his post-graduation and doctoral research in philosophy from the University of Hyderabad. He specializes in epistemology and philosophy of cognitive science. His current research looks at problems of epistemic assessment in the sciences of intelligent systems. He has published in international journals like American Philosophical Quarterly, LNCS, and APA. He is a resource person for FDP workshops in various Indian universities. And prior to his academic career, he has worked in ABB Limited and Kerala State Electricity Board as an engineer. Professor J. Garfield chairs the philosophy department and directs the Buddhist Studies program and Tibetan Studies in India program at Smith College. He is also visiting professor of Buddhist philosophy at Harvard Divinity School, professor of philosophy at Melbourne University, and adjunct professor of philosophy at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. AcademicInfluence.com has identified him as one of the 50 most influential philosophers in the world over the past decade. He is author or editor of over 30 books and nearly 200 articles, chapters, and reviews. Some of his recent works include 2022, Getting Over Ourselves, How to Be a Person Without a Self, 2021, Knowing Illusion, Bringing a Tibetan Debate into Contemporary Discourse, and also 2021, What Can't Be Said, Paradox and Contradiction in East Asian Thought, and there are many, many more. Professor Nalini Bhushan is the Andrew Mellon Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at Smith College. Her research addresses questions in the philosophy of mind and language, aesthetics, philosophy of science, and 19th and 20th century Indian philosophy. She is co-editor of Minds and Molecules, New Essays in the Philosophy of Chemistry, which came out in 2000. She is currently at work on several projects, one of which is on the history of Indian philosophy in the 19th and 20th century, Minds Without Fear, Philosophy in the Indian Renaissance. I welcome all of them again, and I request our first speaker, Professor Deshpande, to take the chair.
So, thank you very much, the chairperson. I first of all take this opportunity to thank Ramakrishna Mission for Ontological Studies and Culture, and Professor Nirmalya Chakravarti for giving me this opportunity to come here and present my views. I think I am audible. Okay. The title of my presentation is Aesthetic Theory and the Ontology of Emotions. Before I begin, I will first make this clarification that the term aesthetic theory in the title of my presentation, it refers to Natya Shastra account of emotions. When we are doing Indian philosophy and when we are dealing with the topic of emotions, the majority of our talk is of the accounts given by Nayayikas, Sankhyas, and these philosophical systems. But out of this kind of philosophy, and what is generally considered as a discipline which is on the periphery of proper philosophy, so to say, I find that there is a very important and very significant discussion of the topic of emotions in Natya Shastra. But that is unfortunately couched in the theory of dramaturgy. And people think that Natya Shastra is all about the stage craft. But actually, in my opinion, Natya Shastra is a very profound, it offers a very profound theory of emotions. And that is what some part of that I will discuss today. So the term aesthetic theory in the title of this presentation refers to Natya Shastra account of emotions. This presentation is restricted to some issues pertaining to Natya Shastra classification of emotions and not with the issues in dramaturgy. Now, general observations before I begin, that contrary to the assumed invariance of human nature, are emotions culturally determined and therefore relative to historical periods and civilizational differences, making emotion-based aesthetic theories cultural variants. A plea for discerning a new primary emotion, and this is a quote from a book, that a plea for discerning a new primary emotion that was not recognized by traditional Indian aesthetic doctrines seem to imply this if one wants to appreciate modern Indian painting in particular, and perhaps modern Indian literature too. This sort of plea highlights the bewilderment of those who are caught in between the tradition and modernity, between indigenous and alien, between availability and non-availability of appropriate Shastra, that is a theory, to appreciate anything that is modern, including the modern art. Rather than finding the tranquil smile of the Buddha, the majesty of Durga, the loving tenderness of Parvati, and the radiance of Nataraja, what one now finds is the fragmented human image in place of the celestial and semi-divine beings placed in the sensuous and lyrical surroundings that used to define the traditional Indian art, especially paintings and sculpture. What one now finds in modern Indian painting is the unmistakable stigma of despair, not just the state of psychological depression, but of an utter and hopeless sense of darkness and hopelessness. Now, what is our take on this new mode of representation? A work of art becomes meaningful in terms of the dominant emotion it expresses. So what is required is a unifying emotion or a set of such emotions that make a work of art as aesthetic. Do our indigenous theoretical resources, especially the rasa theory, equip us with the required unifying emotion to appreciate modern Indian paintings depicting the day-to-day, secular, and the isolated world of individuals, as opposed to the unfailing presence of the mythical, the religious, and the coherent world in the traditional Indian paintings? Some people tell us that the classical Indian aesthetic theory, namely the rasa theory, is inadequate to structure contemporary aesthetic sensibilities, since it does not recognize what is peculiarly modern, namely the emotions of despair, banality, and absurdity. These are the unifying emotions that structure our contemporary states of consciousness, which find their expression in contemporary art and literature. It is possible that despair or something like it might have been experienced or might have been known to the humans of the pre-modern societies. But it could not have been a regular and a formal feature of their psyche. Despair, banality, and absurdity, as we experience them, are the products of modernity. These are typically felt by us living in the modern and the postmodern world. They have become almost a regular and a formal feature of our psyche. And therefore, it is only in the modern times that these emotions have received formal recognition in the existentialist philosophies of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre, as well as in several works of art of the modern period. The narrative of despair and modernity is not without quirks that invite philosophers' unraveling. On this background, that is on this background which summarizes the present, present scenario, if we turn back to Bharata's Natya Shastra and the theory of emotions therein, then what picture do we get? I thought it useful to have to place our reading of Natya Shastra on the background of these two streams. One is the contemporary, our contemporary life, and second, the 3 or 4 contexts in which emotions are discussed in Indian philosophy or in systems of Indian philosophy. First of all, I will give a very brief account of the overall approach to emotions in Indian philosophical schools as a background against which one can turn to the Natya Shastra approach to emotions. There is nothing new, all of us know these things. In various ways, it is noted by Indologists and philosophers that Indian philosophical systems deal with emotions by inquiring into their number In various ways, it is noted by Indologists and philosophers that Indian philosophical systems deal with emotions by inquiring into their number and kind in at least 4 different contexts. The first context being that of self-realization or liberation as conceived in respective metaphysical frameworks of each philosophical system, by focusing on the meditating sadhaka who might be distracted by these passions and emotions in his or her sadhana towards self-realization, which is conceived by these systems as the highest goal of human life. Since the goal is that of liberation of the self, freeing the mind from passions and emotions becomes necessary. In this context, one may recall Patanjali's sutra, which is famous, Chitta Vritti Nirodh, that is quieting of mind by overcoming the vrittis as a precondition for self-realization. The second context in which Indian philosophers have dealt with emotions is in the context of cognition. And we have the Naiyayikas and Bauddhas and the Sankhyas giving different understandings of the issues involved in treating emotions and emotions versus cognition sort of thing. Now the third context in which Indian philosophers have dealt with passions and emotions is in the context of bhakti. Now the fourth context, and this is what takes us to Natya Shastra, the fourth context in which Indian philosophers of literary traditions of Drushya Kavya, that is literature meant to be seen in drama, which is acted out by the actors on the stage, and Shravya Kavya, that is literature meant to be heard, that is poetry recited and read privately. This is a transition which can be stated simply as that from rasa seen to rasa heard, and this is the title of one of Sheldon Pollock's articles. Now, this transition, this Drushya Kavya and Shravya Kavya have dealt with emotions in the domain of dramaturgy and poetry, and specifically in the context of aesthetic experience, which is supposed to be of a special kind, which is supposed to be a special kind of experience of what is called rasa, which indeed is a very complex concept. Bharata defines it as asvadyatvat, that is, that which is capable of being tasted and enjoyed. Now, rasa literally means juice, sap, essence, etc. And these are familiar translations of the word rasa. Now, it is translated in many different ways. Some call it a sentiment, some call it a durable sentiment or a durable psychological state. Some call it an imaginative experience. Some call it a special kind of emotion. Some call it a refined emotion as distinguished from ordinary emotion. Some call it emotion that is formally created through acting on stage. And some call it essence of complete life pattern, whereas some say that rasa is itself natya. Now, all these definitions and all these renderings of the concept of rasa shed some light on the concept of rasa, and I think for our present purposes we can concentrate on this rendering, that some call it as a formally created emotion through acting on stage. So this is something where this Natya Shastra understanding of emotion comes in. Emotion as it is, as it is manifested on the stage by acting by the actors. So what kind of this emotion is, and how does that emotion reaches to the audience? This is the point. On this background, when we turn to Natya Shastra and to the seminal texts of Bharata's Natya Shastra, Abhinav Gupta's Abhinava Bharati, and such other texts which are identified as the source books of Indian aesthetic theory, we find that these traditions and these texts not only catalogue a variety of emotions in great details and with utmost accuracy, but they provide a theory of representation of emotion in arts in general and performing and literary arts in particular. Unlike the Nayayikas and the Bauddhas or the Sankhyas, the Natya Shastra tradition does not assess emotions negatively or as impediments in self-realization. On the contrary, this tradition recognizes emotions of all types as conceivable and as part and parcel of human life. Natya Shastra approach to emotions is primarily in the context of human well-being. This is how I would like to formulate Natya Shastra understanding of emotions, that emotion is to be understood in the context of human well-being. Now, in the context of Indian civilization, human well-being consists in the life lived well according to 4 Purusharthas. So, Natya Shastra approach to emotions is in the context of Purusharthas. This is one possible interpretation of the reading of Natya Shastra. Now, this distinguishes the established reading of Natya Shastra as a treatise for dramatics, for the stage craft or dramaturgy. Interestingly, this sort of recognition of all types of emotions as real is reflected in the portrayal of multiple characters in the epic Mahabharata, where each and every possible human emotion is equally at play, and each and every character is shown to have succeeded or failed in the pursuit of the 4 Purusharthas in a holistic manner. Now, the most famous and widely discussed part of Natya Shastra is the classification of emotions which human beings have or are capable of having. Amongst the emotions that a human being has, some seem to be permanent or durable. Now, these are called sthayi bhavas. Now, those which are not permanent are called vyabhichari bhavas, and they are translated sometimes as complementary psychological states which are transitory, or those that move in relation to sentiments towards different kinds of objects. Now, sthayi bhavas are emotions which are more or less permanent states of consciousness, and they are 8 in numbers. Now, permanence of a sthayi bhav, this again is a much misunderstood idea that bhavas are permanent. Now, what does permanence of a bhava really means? Now, permanence of a sthayi bhava is not to be confused with temporal duration. Permanence of any one or all of the 8 sthayi bhavas is a requirement of a sort for establishing identity of the play and the actor on the stage. So that's why it is said that sthayi bhava pervades the whole play. Now, these sthayi bhavas are rati, hasa, rati that is love, enjoyment, then hasa that is laughter, shoka, krodha, utsaha, bhaya, jugupsa, and vismaya. Now, corresponding to these permanent emotions, Bharata gives a list of 8 rasas, and the concept of rasa is, as I have said, is a much contested concept. These are Shringar, Hasya, Karuna, Raudra, Veera, Bhayanaka, Vibhatsa and Adbhuta. Now these are interpreted as refined emotions as distinguished from ordinary emotions or emotions that are formally created through acting on stage. Now such interpretations have given rise to some of the intense debates in Indian aesthetics, particularly between thinkers in the Natya Shastra and Kavya Shastra tradition. These debates pertain to the nature, number and location of rasas. Now, Vyabhichari bhavas, on the other hand, are counted as 33 in numbers. They are, and I need not give the whole list of 33 Vyabhichari bhavas or transitory emotions. Some of them are Chinta, Smriti, Vrida, Harsha, Sukta, etc. Now coming back to emotions which are classified as permanent, how do we understand the distinction between permanent and transitory emotions? Should we say that this distinction sounds Kantian if we take permanent emotions to be the constitutive and transient emotions to be the regulative features of human nature or of human psyche? The constitutive features of human beings, analogous to Kant's constitutive judgments, would be those whose meaning, truth, or legitimacy is not dependent on any further assumptions, hypothetical conditions, or suppositions. One might say that the kind of human beings that we are, it is impossible to imagine ourselves without the emotions of love, sorrow, anger, fear, and so on. In this sense, the 8 permanent emotions or the states of consciousness are constitutive features of human nature. What we are in terms of these emotions. The permanence of sthayi emotions is not dependent on any further assumption. In this sense, they can be said to be constitutive of human nature. But in the same vein, can we say that a Vyabhichari, that is transitory emotions, are the regulative features of human nature? What does it mean to say that the 33 transient emotions, such as Chinta, Smriti, etc., are the regulative features of human nature? In Kantian framework, the regulative principles or judgments are those whose meaning, truth, or legitimacy is dependent on further assumptions, hypothetical conditions, or suppositions. Likewise, it may be argued that the very transience of the Vyabhichari emotions make them dependent on some further suppositions, etc. However, the reading of Vyabhichari emotions on the analogy of regulative principles in Kantian theory needs further elaboration, and I have not been able to do this further theorizing on this point. Now, the inclusion of certain emotions in the list of permanent emotions by Bharata has been a matter of criticism from the textual criticism point of view. For instance, we may ask why Krodha, for instance, anger, which is the basic of Raudra Rasa, is considered as permanent emotion, but not Dvesh, that is hatred. Or why should Rati be the basis of Shringar and not affection as the basis of motherly love? Now, this kind of question has been asked by many, that why A and why not B, or why B and why not C. So, So this really, falls on the inclusion of certain emotions in the list by Bharata. So what is the criterion of this inclusion? This is the point. In order to understand these inclusions and omissions of emotions from the list of permanent emotions as given by Bharata, we need to know first the criterion for such inclusions and omissions. But such criterion is not available which will justify inclusion and exclusion within the realm of psychology. Now, the point I want to make here is that within the psychological discourse or the discourse in psychology, we cannot really take one emotion and say this is permanent and the other is not. So for that we'll have to have some other grounds on which such picking up of one emotion from amongst many and identifying it or calling it as permanent. So this is, I think, this is the problem here. But such a criterion is not available which will justify inclusion and exclusion within the realm of psychology. That is, from psychological point of view, picking up one emotion from among many and treating it as a permanent emotion creates this unsolvable problem of criterion. Abhinavagupta gives, but some people have given criterion. Abhinavagupta, for instance, gives the criterion in ethical terms. He says that the most essential aesthetic components are those emotions that pertains to the ends of man, which are love, power, law, and liberation. So Abhinavagupta is bringing something which is external to the psychological discourse. If we say that a talk of emotion falls essentially in the psychological discourse, then bringing in ethical considerations is some sort of an importation from outside. Now, another criticism of the list of permanent emotions comes from sociological perspective. From this perspective, there is no such thing as permanent or stable emotions which are not culturally determined. Emotions are culturally determined and therefore relative to historical periods and civilizational differences. Now this explains why there is no mention of such emotions which are typically modern emotions as despair, banality, and absurdity in the list of emotions given by Bharata. As against this, it can be pointed out that Bharata's list has in fact listed what is now meant by despair among the Vyabhichari bhavas. The term Vishad is sometimes translated as despair or dejection, and we are familiar with its cognates like Nairashya in Marathi or Hatasha in Hindi, and also in all other Indian languages equivalent terms will be there. So surely the issue here is not that of translation of terms, but to know what exactly constitutes the content of despair and what is the range of meanings does the term despair cover. This would partly be a philosophical exercise. It would partly be a philological exercise. But in philosophical parlance, especially in philosophy of language, this is the issue of what Wittgenstein wants us to realize, that concepts form a family, sharing with one another similarities and differences in terms of various aspects. This, as we know, expels the myth of the meaning of a word or of a concept. This insight also applies to the concept of despair. In fact, to historicize an emotion is to hold that it has no ancestry in the functioning of human mind, or that there are no cognate terms forming a family. Here, Here, one might also ask whether emotions of despair, banality, and absurdity were not felt or were felt differently by the humans of the pre-modern societies. If that were so, what exactly would be the difference in experiencing a certain emotion under different descriptions? How would one know that she is experiencing now an emotion E under description M, which is different from experiencing the same E under description N? Is there a categorical difference between the way despair, banality, and absurdity are available to the modern and the pre-modern man? Were these emotions not, in a significantly existential sense, available to the humans of the pre-modern age? These issues collapse into the deep metaphysics of how our worldviews shape our psychology, and how do they determine the kind of aesthetic theories that we have. This and related issues extend over the classical aesthetic theories, which are based on substantive human psychology and the invariance thesis of human nature. Rather than to invariance, are they vulnerable to the variance of human nature when it is said that emotions are anchored in socio-political environment? Now, coming to Natya Shastra, the classification of emotions and the concept of rasa is generally discussed as a focal point of the text of Natya Shastra, but mostly overlooking the wider context of the Natya itself. This is probably because the first adhyaya of Natya Shastra gives the origin of Natya in the form of a myth of its creation by the great Brahma, the creator of the universe. Whether the creation of Natya by Brahma is a myth or not is a different issue. The point is that unless one knows what is Natya, one will not be able to see the significance of rasa and of emotions as sthai and vyabhichari. So, what Natya Shastra tells us, as far as I understand, is that the discourse of emotions cannot come about in the absence of the idea of Natya. So it is within the framework of Natya that Natya Shastra deals with emotions, and this distinction between the sthai and the vyabhichari and so on. In fact, the first adhyaya of Natya Shastra is an elaboration of Bharata's answers to 5 questions about the nature of Natya. And in most expositions of Natya Shastra, either by Indologists or philosophers, this part is somehow overlooked. These 5 questions, in the form of, I'm just funny here. I don't have much to say. In fact, the first adhyaya of Natya Shastra is an elaboration of Bharata's answers to 5 questions about the nature of Natya. These questions are: how did Brahma come to create Natya and also Natya Shastra? Natya is for whom? Then, third question, how many elements are there in Natya? Fourth question, what is the scope of Natya? And finally, what is Natya supposed to do? Unfortunately, in most expositions of Natya Shastra, these questions are either overlooked by treating them as part of a myth, or emphasis is given to the details of the stagecraft as described in Natya Shastra. But these 5 questions are fundamental questions about Natya, which ultimately lead to the understanding of human life. Now, it's since you have given me 5 minutes, I think I should stop here but I should summarize this. How do I do that? Okay, this answer to this question, I'll just take 2-3 minutes, okay. The answers to these questions create a framework for a proper and deeper understanding of rasa and sthai and vyabhichari bhavas. In the absence of the knowledge of this framework, one gets the impression that I think I have read. The characteristics of Natya are exemplified in the answers in question and answer type dialogue between Bharata Muni and Atreya Muni along with other Munis. Now I'll just mention these characteristics of Natya and there I'll stop. 1. The Natya must give the knowledge of good and evil and also the knowledge of the goal of life in a community where both good and evil exist. Now, in order to perform this task, it is for those who have learned to control evil in them. 3. The elements of Natya are 6. They are rasa, bhava, abhinaya, vritti, nritta, instrumental and vocal music. And the 4th answer is that the scope of Natya is all that happens in the 3 worlds, namely the world of gods, the world of mortals, and the world of asuras. Natya does not present, this is very important, and here I'll just mention that and then stop. Natya does not present only what is good or present only what is good when both good and evil are present, or show superiority of good over evil. Natya must show the attraction and repulsion to both good and evil. Even when one recognizes what is good and what is evil, one must still choose to do evil. The Natya presents both the good life and the bad life and the proper and improper pursuit of goals of life, namely dharma, artha, kama and moksha. Natya is instructive to all kinds of people, to the best and the worst and the average. It gives self-possession, pleasure, etc. and it comforts those afflicted with unhappiness, sorrow and so on. So it is, I have developed this whole understanding that in this context of these 5 questions and the 5 answers, that how Bharata elaborates his theory of emotions and in the overall context of Purushartha. So one might call it as a Purushartha-centric understanding of emotions as given by Bharata. So that of course is the later part of my presentation, but I take a pause here and I stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande, for your highly analytical and thought-provoking paper, connecting the understanding of emotions to the Purusharthas and to the overall well-being of perhaps all conscious kind. And it encourages us to think out of the box about some known traditional issues in Indian philosophy. Thank you, but maybe take the questions all together at the end, because we have 2 of our speakers who will be coming in online. So may I request the organizers to arrange for the online part of the program. So we have Professor J. Garfield and
They are there.
Professor Nalini Bhushan. Hello to both of you from Kolkata, from Ramakrishna Mission. They will be speaking on the freedom in subject as freedom, how K.C. Bhattacharya's understanding of Vedānta informs his Magnum Opus. Over to you, speakers, please.
Thank you very much. Really thrilled to be here. 6:20 in the morning our time, but we're here. I will begin and we will go back and forth presenting together, because this is collaborative work. While Subject as Freedom was written in 1930, in 1925, Bhattacharya wrote Shankara's Doctrine of Maya, and in 1936, he wrote the essay that's going to be the focus of our talk today, which is the Advaita and its spiritual significance. Now, why are we interested in this particular essay? we found that a close reading of these essays, these two essays together, convince us that the respective arguments in these essays are not merely aligned or consistent with the arguments in K.C. Bhattacharya's book, Subject is Freedom, although this by itself would be a productive discovery. Rather, reading the text through this broader lens and through the filter of this particular intellectual infrastructure revealed to us something stronger with regard to the broader philosophical context of Bhattacharya's central argument in Subject is Freedom. At its philosophical core, we think, Subject as Freedom is quite clearly K.C. Bhattacharya's modern defense of Advaita Vedānta philosophy. This is so despite the fact that in writing Subject as Freedom, Bhattacharya takes great pains to write about subjectivity, objectivity, and the self in explicitly neutral terms, often introducing novel terminology of his own, terminology that often both reflects and occludes the ancestry of the ideas that he articulates. This apparent neutrality has resulted in the work being variously interpreted as the modern defense of either Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Advaita, Kantian, or Husserlian schools of thought. While these are good arguments in the scholarly literature in support of each of these hypotheses, and while threads from these other traditions are clearly woven into the text, we argue that at its core, Subject as Freedom is primarily Advaita. Indeed, the very title, Subject as Freedom, as we will argue, expresses a distinctive Advaita-inflected commitment to the ultimate non-duality of subjectivity. To be sure, as many studies of classical Indian systems demonstrates, K.C. Bhattacharya thought hard about and drew insights from other Indian philosophical schools. But his lodestone is Advaita Vedānta. Indeed, of all of his studies of the classical schools, which we find collected in the Naklas, edited by his son Gopinath, in all of his studies in Vedanta is the only one that was polished to the point that it can be considered a complete treatise. And so the essay that we will attend to in this talk can be seen as crystallizing some of the ideas developed in that study. But it's one thing to assert this and another to convince you of the plausibility of this bold claim. And so we are going to convince you of it in the next section. So as we move to this next section, we are going to focus on that second essay that I identified called The Advaita and Its Spiritual Significance. To take this essay seriously, we think, is to confront the fact that his magnum opus, Subject is Freedom, was primarily about epistemology and the phenomenology of subjectivity. While it is about that, it also has an important religious and indeed soteriological dimension. To fail to appreciate this is to miss K.C. Bhattacharya's motivation in the book and to miss a critical dimension in his critique of Kant, that is, his rejection of the idea that the distinction between reason and faith
Recording in progress.
Constitutes a limit to philosophical inquiry as opposed to a boundary. Subject as Freedom is, as all commentators have noted, first and foremost an exploration of subjectivity itself. KCB's principal project is to argue that even though the subject of experience and agency is never an object of knowledge, it nevertheless must be known if any other knowledge is possible, and that it can be known. He attempts to show just how that knowledge is to be achieved and to demonstrate that subjectivity itself is a certain kind of freedom. KCB follows Kant's lead in pursuing an understanding of the possibility of knowledge, grounded in an analysis of the contribution of the knowing subject to experience, and in taking seriously the idea that subjectivity and agency each presuppose a kind of transcendental freedom. This, however, is not the whole story. There is another, even more important wellspring of KCB's philosophical ideas, and that is the Advaita Vedānta tradition, and in particular the philosophy of Shankara. The final account of self-knowledge and subjectivity in Subject is Freedom is an articulation of Shankara's non-dual understanding of experience and of the immediacy and indubitability of self-knowledge. KCB takes this non-dual self-knowledge to constitute the transcendence of cosmic illusion and the recognition of the subject's absolute freedom. Thus, this Vedanta orientation entails two important respects in which KCB parts company with Kant. And each of these is important in order to fully appreciate the motivation and the philosophical program of Subject is Freedom, not as an articulation of Kant's program in an Indian register, but actually as a correction of Kant's program, inspired by Indian insights. Both points of departure concern a rejection of the limits that Kant places on reason. The first respect in which KCB departs from Kant concerns the possibility of self-knowledge. The limits of thought, Kant argues, are the limits of the phenomenal world. Kant argues that the transcendental subject, as opposed to the empirical object of inner sense, that the transcendental subject is therefore not knowable, since it is noumenal, but not subject to the categories and non-spatial temporal. That is, it lies beyond the limits of knowledge. KCB sees this conclusion as opening an intolerable skeptical abyss. For if, as Kant himself argues, all knowledge is mediated by representations, those representations must be known in order for any content they represent to be known. And that knowledge, in turn, must constitute the knowledge that they are my representations. The second respect concerns the relation between reason and faith. And this is the one that interests us the most for this paper. Kant famously claims that a central goal of the first critique is to draw a boundary of the domain of reason to make room for a domain of faith. That boundary, however, in the Kantian framework also constitutes a limit on knowledge. KCB takes Advaita Vedanta to be first and foremost a religious orientation to the world, and he takes the point of Advaita to be the achievement of moksha or spiritual liberation. For this reason, his use of Vedanta as an analytical framework to understand subjectivity and freedom imports faith into the domain of knowledge. So while KCB accepts the Kantian distinction between reason and faith and the reality of the boundary between them, he denies that this entails that knowledge is limited to the domain within the bounds of reason.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the general framework of KCB's Vedanta. Krishna Chandra's Vedanta, like his Kantianism, is somewhat heterodox. He adopts the Vedanta reading of Brahman, or the cosmic self, as constituted by the triad of Sat, Chit, and Ananda. It's useful to begin in the middle of this essay, The Spiritual Significance of Vedanta. I'm going to read to you one paragraph, that's paragraph 12. And this is KCB speaking. Brahman is the eternal self that has not only no positive determination, but has not even the negative determination of consciously rejecting positive determination. The individual self has not only to correct for himself his subjective illusion of individuality, not only to wait for the cosmic illusion of individuality to be corrected, but also to contemplate all correction itself to be illusory. He has to contemplate moksha not as something to be reached or effected or remanifested, not even as an eternal predicament of the self, but as the self itself, or the svarupa of Brahman. The self, or the absolute, is not a thing having freedom, but is freedom itself. The echoes of subjective freedom there are really obvious. That is, because we can only know Brahman through the conceptual lens of Sat Chit Ananda, and through characteristics that we also know it to lack, our understanding of the absolute, and so of the self or subject, is always itself subject to illusion. And when Krishna Chandra writes that the individual self has not only to correct for himself its subjective illusion of individuality, not only to wait for the cosmic illusion of individuality to be corrected, but also to contemplate all correction itself to be illusory. KCB notes the bottomless nature of this paradox. So long as our subjectivity is individual, and hence dual in nature, even the awareness of being subject to illusion is illusory. KCB concludes not that the subject is free, but that the self is freedom, and therefore that freedom is not something to be attained, but rather to be immediately realized through a kind of swaprakasha. In drawing this conclusion, KCB is emphasizing first the identity of the self with subjectivity, and second, the identity of subjectivity with a kind of freedom. To know the subject as determined, as Shankara and Kant would agree, would be to know it as an object, and it would hence no longer be a subject. And no object can be absolutely free. Objects are bound to the conditions of subjectivity, including spatio-temporal location, as well as causal determination. So it would be contradictory to take the subject both to be an object, that is, to be known as an object is, and to be free. But subjectivity is freedom, and so freedom and subject are a unity, not an object property dyad. Moksha, therefore, is the very freedom in which the subject consists, and self-knowledge is the illumination of this freedom. In the next paragraph of this essay, KCB expands on this point when he writes, "The individual illusorily thinks that he is not free and wants to be free. To his consciousness, accordingly, there is the necessity of a sadhana, or a discipline to attain freedom. That is, according to KCB, dualistic self-awareness is the awareness of the self as object, and so as unfree. And this suggests an aspiration to attain freedom, and so the necessity of spiritual discipline as a vehicle for that attainment. This, however, KCB argues, is simply one more aspect of Maya." Philosophical reflection takes us to the knowledge of reality, but that doesn't take us to truth. The latter requires the cultivation of feeling or of faith. KCB argues that we cannot know our own freedom, but that we can come to feel it, and that we can realize it through the cultivation of an interior consciousness of our own subjectivity, which, to the degree that it reveals our own true nature, must be non-dual, hence non-objectifying, and therefore the only final route to the intuition of our own nature as freedom itself. So while KCB agrees with Kant that the self lies outside of the boundaries of reason, he does not think it lies outside the limits of our consciousness. Instead, he argues for an expansion of our understanding of our own epistemic resources. Krishna Chandra articulates the spiritualized epistemology in the context of the Bhagavad Gita. He argues that each of the three yogas prescribed in the text, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, and jnana yoga, of these, the discipline of knowledge of jnana yoga is part of the duty or the svadharman of a Vedantin. The first yoga, the karma yoga, is realized through service and through ecumenism, a recognition of the equal claim of all religions to be vehicles for the realization of truth, and of the relativity of truth to the individual religious practitioner. The echoes of both Ramakrishna and Gandhi are very clear in that account. The second, he argues, that is Bhakti Yoga, is the doctrine of Adhikari Bheda, according to which different individuals have distinct spiritual status, each status entailing a distinct set of religious attitudes and obligations. Nonetheless, KCB writes, from the standpoint of toleration, one not only respects the inner achievement of a person admitting an inferior status, but can wholeheartedly identify oneself with it. The highest adhikaran should feel it a privilege to join in the worship of the humblest. KCB argues, though, that of these three yogas, Jnana Yoga is supreme, thus locating philosophy not only as intrinsically connected to religious practice, but as contributing to the highest religious practice. Once again, devotion and action are recognized as important practices and orientations, but these, he argues, are merely preparatory for the development of insight into and faith in that to which he refers as truth. And by truth, he means non-dual subjectivity that reveals the identity of freedom and the self as subject. But as we saw above, reason can take us only so far in this quest. And that latter must be cast aside if we're to see the world aright, as Wittgenstein put much the same point in the Tractatus. The goal of philosophical activity is a transformation of experience, of feeling, in KCB's language. Subjective freedom may be the latter, but to understand why we should bother climbing it, we have to keep in mind what is taken to be at the top.
And this takes us back to illusion once again. Illusion is never very far from K.C. Bhattacharya's thinking in this context. So with this more religious understanding of Advaita in view, we can return in a new register to illusion and freedom. KCB understands Maya in this paper as adhyasa or superimposition. He argues that this is the fundamental idea motivating all of Vedanta, and that Vedanta practice makes sense only as the extirpation or removal of Maya. Quote, Vedanta starts with the notion of adhyasa and presupposes such an experience of spiritual detachment from the body, including the empirical mind, unquote. KCB takes the rope-snake analogy as the principal illustration of adhyasa, as we all know. When we take the rope to be a snake, we perceive the rope, but superimpose a non-existent snake on the existent rope, falsely taking ourselves to perceive the snake. Without the superimposition, there is no illusion. In this essay, KCB emphasizes the importance of feeling as opposed to simply knowing. We are partially freed from the illusion of the snake when we recognize the reality of the snake, of the rope, the fact of superimposition, and the fact that that which we superimpose is non-existent. But real freedom from the illusion requires us to address not only the cognitive side of the illusion, we must also cease to feel the reality of the superimposed illusion, just as we eventually cease to feel the reality of the snake we originally took to be present once we come to see the rope as a rope. At the cosmic level, KCB will take pure subjectivity or the self as identical with Brahman to be the underlying reality. The individuality of the self or its identity with the particular nama rupa, which is the psychophysical complex, and the subsequent duality of subject and object is the superimposed illusion. So the task of spiritual practice, including prominently philosophical practice, is then both the demonstration that the adhyasa is illusory and the undoing of the feeling of its reality. KCB identifies wonder as a primary feeling that is cultivated in this process. Illusion is distinct from error, KCB urges, in that its correction, unlike the correction of a mere false belief, elicits the feeling of wonder. This feeling then is a sign that adhyasa is falling away. When we see the rope on the ground in plain light, we wonder, how could we have ever thought that it was a scaly snake? We then come to be aware that what KCB calls our individuality, what might be better put as our separation as subjects from an objective world, that our individuality is merely an illusion. To take particularity and duality to be illusory is to feel it to be impossible, like seeing the rope as a rope, even though one is cognizant of the illusory superimposition. Transcending illusion requires the awareness of the illusion and the feeling, not just the knowledge, that the illusion is truly illusory. This is why philosophical argument is both necessary and insufficient for the realization of the truth. It is necessary in order to come to the understanding that enables us to reject superimposition and to come to know the unreality of duality and individuation. But philosophical argument is insufficient because to internalize that recognition in a way that frees us from its thrall requires a psychological transformation, achievable, KCB thinks, only through sadhana. We can now ask once again, with the paradox of identity and difference of the I and the me in view, about the structure of the adhyasa that constitutes the illusion of individuality. KCB opens this discussion in these words, and this is section 5 of that essay, The Advaita and Its Spiritual Significance. I'm going to quote KCB. There are apparently two illusions, of the I appearing as you, and there is also, therefore also as me, and of the you appearing as I. In the spiritual consciousness, in which a person wonders how he could be what he cannot be, he corrects the former illusion, that is the I appearing as you, but not the latter, that is the you appearing as I. For unless the past self was still present, there could be no sense of intellectual absurdity. With the correction of the first illusion, he sees that the appearance of identity with the body should also be illusory. He sees that it should be, but he still does not actually disbelieve it, unquote. And that you'll recognize as quintessentially KCB style of thinking, right? So in all of this, where is the snake and where is the rope? And what are the stages of illusion and its dissipation? First, note that KCB is diagnosing two illusions here, and that they are mirror images of each other. The first involves taking the self to be an object. The second involves taking a certain object, that is the body, to be the self. We will take these two illusions one by one before turning to KCB's account of what he calls cosmic illusions. In the first illusion, the I as subject is the rope. The me, the objectively appearing psychophysical reality, is the snake. I superimpose my objective appearance to myself on the self. This is not, though, KCB emphasizes, to take my identity to be purely objective, however. I must be simultaneously aware of myself as a subject in order to identify myself in the first place. It is therefore to take myself as to be an objective subject, if you will, an incoherent melange of objectivity and subjectivity. It is the recognition of this incoherence in philosophical reflection that constitutes the second stage of the dialectic, the realization that I, as subject, cannot be identical to anything objective, although I still feel myself to be. Just as when I realize that the rope is not a snake, the snake still hovers, right, as a felt presence. To ascend to the third stage of the dialectic, that at which the snake becomes not, is therefore the vanishing of the feeling that I am identical with my empirical or objective reality, a feeling of freedom from the psychophysical complex that is me. This does not, KCB argues, by itself free one from the second illusion, the illusion that the objective me is identical to the I or the self. Here, the rope is the mind-body complex. The snake is the superimposed subjectivity. So liberation from illusion is coming to see those previous and successive stages of my being as objects from which I am free. KCB concludes from this discussion that this is, quote, not his individual illusion, but a cosmic illusion, the dissipation of which would mean for him the realization that the body and the entire world of which it is the point of reference are illusory, unquote. And that's still section 5. This is, KCB suggests, the recognition of the illusory nature of our identification with the mind-body, to realize that that identification is more than just the confusion of one thing with another, as in the case of the snake and the rope, when this case is taken literally. It is instead the confusion of the subject with its object. The dissipation of that illusion leads to the realization that the only reality for us is the subjective. What appears to be object can only be present to us as the content of our consciousness. Its objectivity as independent of and external to us as a world against which we stand is illusion. This is the truth to which Advaita challenges us to believe. KCB puts it in this way, and this is section 6 of that essay. Quote, to be conscious of oneself as individual or me is to be conscious of me as illusory and of the subject or I as the truth. The me is the prototype of objectivity, and to feel it to be illusory is to be aware of the possibility of objectivity itself being illusory. We take a particular object to be illusory only as we believe in the objective world, but we would never conceive the illusoriness of the world itself unless we started with the illusoriness of me, unquote. KCB thus draws the explicit link between the non-duality of experience and the illusory character of individuality in the Advaita framework. Non-duality entails that the external world is illusion. Distinction among individuals presupposes distinct empirical or spatial temporal reality, that is, objective distinction. Without an objective reality, in the context of which to draw these distinctions, there is hence no real individuality. And this takes us directly to the doctrine of Maya as cosmic illusion. And here's one more quote from that essay. Quote, the illusion of a snake being corrected arouses wonder. Wonder should mean that this rope, being a snake, is a contradiction that yet was presented. The spiritual consciousness of one's illusory individuality is explicit consciousness of the self having been believed as not self. It is the illusion of individuality, therefore, that suggests the theory of objective illusion called anivakya kyativaga, inexpressible error. The rope, then, on this analogy is ultimately Brahman. The apparent snake is Maya, and the illusion is to superimpose Maya on Brahman and to take what is merely real to be in fact true, to accept duality and individuation where there is none. Philosophical reflection following the Advaita Vedānta analytical strategy can convince us that the rope is not a snake. It can convince us that Brahman lies beyond Maya. It can also convince us that the snake is mere illusion, that Maya is not the truth of our being. So philosophical reflection can do that, right? It can go that far. But it cannot take us to the final stage. It is insufficient to induce the feeling of the unreality of the world or the wonder that attends it. To achieve that freedom from the spell of Maya, from the hypnotic gaze of the serpent, requires spiritual practice for which analysis is a mere precondition, although one that gets its point precisely from that spiritual goal.
And this brings us back to KCB's understanding of the nature of freedom. If Maya presents us to ourselves as objects, and hence as unfree, as bound, when we are liberated from that Maya, we come to feel or to realize ourselves as freedom. What is it that we then, in fact, find? We can distinguish two relevant senses of freedom in this context. The first, we might say, is a kind of relative freedom, the freedom we take ourselves to have in our ordinary sense of agency, in the reality in which we encounter ourselves and others as individuals, the realm of Maya. This is a freedom to perform some act or other. It's a power of the mind or body. I might, for instance, be free to raise my arm, or free to vote, or free to reflect on the work of Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya. But the second sense of freedom, we might say, is absolute freedom. A freedom from, not a freedom to, and it's a freedom from illusion, a freedom from dualistic appearance, a freedom from objects of knowledge, and a freedom from any identification with the namarupa of our individual appearance. This is the freedom in which Brahman consists. KCB distinguishes between these in terms of the distinction between Ishvara, the personified creator of the universe, the deity present in the world, and Brahman, the ultimate reality with which the self is identical. Even though Ishvara is in one sense identical with Brahman as his manifestation, he is at the same time distinct. Brahman is truth. Ishvara is implicated in Maya. The freedom of Ishvara is Shakti. It's the power to create the universe and to act in it. KCB writes, the freedom of Brahman is moksha, freedom from all duality, all objectification, freedom from adhyasa, and so from Maya. It is this freedom that constitutes subjectivity itself. And this explains it another way, why KCB regards the subject not as free, but as freedom itself. To be free would be to possess Shakti, to be able to act on objects as an individuated locus of power. It's a freedom too. This would be to be involved in the adhyasa of duality and individuation that is Maya. And this in turn would be to be bound by our objects and by objectivity itself, and to take ourselves to be objects among other objects, even if that were in the context of knowing oneself to be in the thrall of illusion. So that would be like freeing oneself from the illusion of the snake, but still feeling the presence of the snake. Even if one were to know oneself to be free, this is not what it is to feel oneself as free. To feel freedom, in what KCB calls the cosmic sense, is to feel freedom from individuation and from the duality of subject and object. It's easy to think that this means that one experiences oneself as the subject pole of the subject-object polarity with no object at all. But that, KCB argues, would be a deep confusion. Instead, it's to experience the absence of that polarity entirely, the absence of subject-object polarity. So to just feel oneself to be pure subject with no object, that's just one more aspect of Maya. This is why Brahman is inexpressible, and why there is no thing that is free. Merely in this experience, there's merely freedom. Jnana, or insight, is thus necessary but not sufficient for the manifestation of this freedom. It's necessary because theoretical insight is required for the recognition of the structure of the adhyasa that constitutes cosmic illusion, and so to direct one towards the cessation of that superimposition. Just as in the case of the rope and the snake, one cannot free oneself from the feeling that there's a snake without first coming to know that there's only a rope. But just as in the case of the rope and the snake, coming to know is not sufficient to extirpate the feeling. One must also let go of that feeling of apprehension, and that takes a transformation not of cognition, but also a transformation of perception and of affect. That's why philosophy has to also be sadhana. KCB puts the point this way in paragraph 15 of that essay. And here's an extensive quotation from KCB. Advaitism as religion and philosophy in one is at once individualistic and universalistic in its spiritual outlook. Religion is nothing if not individualistic. It's an inwardizing of one's subjective being, a deepening of one's spiritual individuality. Philosophy, on the other hand, is essentially universalistic in its attitude, presenting a truth that is for all, not merely the mystic experience of the individual philosopher. As an explicit religion, Advaitism insists on the conservation of one's spiritual individuality, or swadharma. As an explicit philosophy, it takes every individual self as the one self or reality. And at the same time, as an implicit religion, it denies the world that is common to all and retires into the solitude of subjectivity. So philosophy in the explicit discursive expression, philosophy is the explicit discursive expression of an insight that is only transformative once inwardized in religious practice. KCB argues, but there is nothing to inwardize without the philosophical work necessary to reckon with pervasive cognitive illusion. In Vedānta, then, philosophy and religion are inextricable from one another. Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya thus closes this essay with this thought, reinforcing the close connection between jnana and bhakti, indeed treating them as opposite sides of a single coin.
So now we conclude. We've seen that the Advaita framework, we have seen that the Vedanta framework that KCB adopts in this essay for sure is more than purely analytical. Although once again, this is never made explicit in his book, The Subject is Freedom, we can now see that his project there, that is in the book, is also in an important sense spiritual. The dialectic developed there can and should be read as part of, or at least as a prolegomenon to a sadhana. This is an aspect of the text that has so far, we think, not been sufficiently noted by most readers, and one that will allow us to share more light on the text. It reveals that KCB's purpose in philosophy is not detached contemplation, but instead to achieve a deeper spiritual self-understanding. He aims to provide not simply an explication of freedom, but also a guide to the realization of the freedom in which KCB thinks that our own being consists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhushan and Professor Garfield, for taking us through a wonderful new journey of exploration on KCB's notions of freedom, illusion, and self in his subject as freedom. This was kind of a journey with a double view because we caught glimpses of KCB's individuality and Advaita, the universal appeal of Advaita, but throughout it was Professor Bhushan and Professor Garfield. Thank you for that wonderful analysis. Can we have one quick question?
Hello. First of all, I must thank you. Wonderful, for your explanation, and particularly the person who was not known to me a few minutes before, that is KCV. It's really wonderful. So thank you. And at least more than 25 times you have named KCB. So thank you once again. I feel proud as a Bengali that you have such a respect for the person. And I'm really astonished that simple confusion, that means that truth is relative. When we touch a rope and consider it's a snake, that means truth is relative, right? And it's a confusion. And the way you explain, I really admire, whether I should admire you or KCB, that's really wonderful. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We won't be able to take any further questions, but if they would like to say anything.
Yeah, I'm Nirmalya, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I just thank Nalini and Jay for more than one reasons. First of all, for waking up so early in the morning and explaining these difficult texts of KCB to us. But I would like to share some good news with Jay, because remember that you wrote a short endorsement for the volume by Kalidas Bhattacharyya, and that book has been formally released yesterday in the inauguration program of this seminar. So thank you, Jay, for that, and we shall send you a copy of that book very soon. Okay?
Thank you. That's wonderful news. I'm so happy to hear that book.
And the book was formally released by Janardhan. I don't know whether Janardhan is here today. Okay, maybe he's somewhere. So Janardhan actually is with us. So he formally released the book yesterday. So thank you, Jay, very much. And thank you, Nalini, again.
Oh, you're welcome.
Take care. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. We have been waiting patiently for our third speaker, Professor Don Wallace D. Cruz. He'll be talking on cognitive capacities and machine intelligence. Professor D. Cruz.